Hey, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. I'm in Japan right now and hope you're also in a comfortable place, excited about this upcoming training, this online training on integrating the graduation approach, also we call economic inclusion into ADB operation. So many of you might know me, but my name is Yukiko Ito. I'm the Principal Social Development Specialist at the Social Development Thematic Group at ADB, one of the organizers for this training. So allow me to kickstart this training by bringing in Karen Selsick, who's a Principal Social Sector Specialist at East Asia Department, ADB, who is also the chair of the Graduation Working Group at ADB to open for this training. Go ahead, Karen.
Thank you so much, Yuki, and hi, everybody. I am so pleased to welcome everyone to this program. It has been a long time in development and organization. It's the culmination of a lot of work organized by the Graduation Working Group that Yuki just mentioned. It's a small but super dedicated team under the Social Development Thematic Group in our Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. And we have lots of excellent speakers and experts to guide you through the next couple of days. And, you know, I'm sure most of you know what the graduation approach is. You signed up for this program after all. But just to set the stage, you know, we're talking about economic inclusion or cash plus type programs that provide this very specific and comprehensive set of sequenced interventions to poor households. These include social assistance and cash transfers, a productive asset transfer, technical and life skills training, financial inclusion, and personalized coaching and mentoring throughout. People select their productive assets based on a local market assessment and on their preferences and previous experiences. But no matter what you call it, graduation, economic inclusion, cash plus, basically it's an innovative, holistic, and a very much proven approach based on evidence under the broad sort of social protection and jobs heading. The key idea is that it gives poor and vulnerable households a big targeted boost in terms of economic opportunities and psychosocial support, helping them to diversify incomes and make their livelihoods more sustainable and resilient. What are we doing at ADB? Well, at the moment, ADB is financing graduation initiatives in India, in Mongolia, and in the Philippines. And many other countries have expressed growing interest, including in what we think is a really important new area, which is the context of designing income and livelihood restoration efforts for families that have been affected by involuntary resettlement caused by infrastructure development projects. Beyond this, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately, I can see application of the approach to any context where there is displacement or migration, voluntary or involuntary, but basically where people who were already poor and vulnerable to begin with have to start over somewhere new because it's such a holistic kind of package of support. So in 2 sessions spread over the next 2 days, 2 afternoons in Manila, we are fortunate to have a great mix of ADB staff, consultants, and country counterparts coming together to better understand the core concepts of the graduation approach, but also to explore together how we can integrate graduation elements into ADB's portfolio of lending and grants in our developing member countries. Some of you, some participants have also signed up for 45-minute one-on-one consultation sessions on Wednesday and Thursday with our expert facilitators, and you are in for a treat. You will get very individualized support for any questions you might have. You know, I won't go into detailed introductions here because there will be ample time to get to know Odd and Hashmi and Dristi over the coming days, and my colleague Yuki will facilitate a getting to know each other session in just a second. But before that, I wanted to introduce a short video called 4 Things You Need to Know About the Graduation Approach for Poverty Reduction, and then I'll hand back over to you, Yuki. So thanks and welcome, everyone. Looking forward to it.
The graduation approach is a type of social protection program that builds on cash transfer with other types of support for the very poorest. It has lots of different names. There's the graduation approach. Some organizations call it cash plus programming. Others call it productive inclusion, but it all means the same thing. It's a multidimensional approach to poverty reduction. The graduation approach is targeted to working age adults in the family with livelihood support, with the coaching, with the connection to banking, etc. The elements of the graduation approach include cash transfers, then transfer of a productive asset like a sewing machine or livestock or a food cart, and then technical training on that particular asset. Then there is coaching and mentoring to connect people to banking services, to health services, and it's that coaching and mentoring element that really sets the approach apart. The approach is complex and integrated, so it involves a lot of coordination between perhaps different parts of the same ministry, but also across different ministries that might be involved in poverty reduction. It's also a rather expensive type of intervention. You require a lot of human resources. The cost is a challenge, but there are opportunities and ways to potentially bring the cost down. We're testing in the Philippines a group coaching approach, where one facilitator or coach might work with 15 to 20 households and have regular coaching sessions. So that would necessarily involve less time, less human resources, and it could very well have the same outcome in terms of empowerment and poverty reduction. There's lots of global evidence to show that this type of approach works and works very well. We have rigorous impact evaluation from around the world. After all the interventions ended, after the coaching stopped, the technical training stopped, 1 year later, researchers went back and found that everybody was still on a very positive trajectory up toward and over the poverty line. And that's unique.
Okay, everyone. So I hope you enjoyed the video. This is in the ADB webpage. So maybe later on and in the agenda, there's a web link that you can recycle and have a look. So if it's okay with everyone in this room, we'd like you to open up the camera for those who really can. And we encourage to do so just for a few minutes. And I like to start by taking a group photo as our souvenir. So would you be able to open up your cameras, please? And then I'll ask my colleague Jen to just kick in and let us know when you're taking the photo. Jen, so over to you.
Thanks, everyone. My colleague Sheila and I will have the group photo. We have 5 slides today for all the videos that are on. So we'll just request you to smile all throughout. Let's start off with the first batch, please. Thank you. In 3, 2, 1. Hold on a second. Okay, rest with your smile first while we save this. Thank you. Okay, we move on to the next batch. In 3, 2, 1. And there we have it. Just rest for a bit while we save again. Okay. Now on to the third batch. I think this is the final one. The others, you can still have your videos on while we wait for you. Okay. We're clicking now in 3, 2, 1. Okay, there we have it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. You're really free to just shut off your camera or just turn it on as you wish, because it's going to be a very informal kind of a training. We're just like-minded people coming together to learn something from each other. So who are we in this room? So I just want to give a snapshot of who we are. So we had about 90 people signed up for this online training. Some are on live. I think we have about 70 right now, and others will be listening to the recording. And I really hope, as all of our organizers is, to enjoy the session across these 2 days. So we have broken down into like 50 ADB staffs and consultants, and the others would be 40 counterparts that we work with closely with the governments or the NGOs, and they are coming from India, Mongolia, Philippines, Sri Lanka, hopefully the Marshall Islands as well. So ADB is diverse. We have everyone from the 5 regional departments. We also have people from private sector operation, Office of Auditor General, Independent Evaluation, and Sustainable Development Climate Change Department across different varieties of units and division, from evaluation to gender, transport, regional cooperation, rural agriculture, social development, social safeguards, and urban development. And many of them are joining from the resident missions in ADB from Azerbaijan, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Laos, Mongolia, Pakistan, Philippines, China, Sri Lanka, Uzbekistan, and many others. So let me introduce the 3 graduation economic inclusion experts we have with us today. Aude de Montesquieu, everyone is experts in the graduation economic inclusion space. Aude de Montesquieu is a social protection and graduation approach advisor for this training. Saeed Hashmi is a resource person for integrating the graduation approach or economic inclusion into ADB operations for this task. And Dristi Shrestha, who is a senior social development specialist, graduation approach, including for this online training. And we also have colleagues supporting us to make this training a success. They are Sheila Reynoso, Maria Genevieve Idar, Fatima Angela Marifosque, and Joven Valenzuela. So they are, I think, being in touch with you to make this a success. So before we proceed to the actual sessions, and the agenda for today is on the screen for you, as a housekeeping information, the discussion materials will be shared after this session by the Secretariat. And there will also be Q&A for each of the sessions. So please start using the chat box anytime or during the Q&A session. You can raise your hand during the session and ask questions directly. And all the questions that you will be posing, whether verbally or on written, will be in the virtual whiteboard, so that we'll make sure your questions will be addressed during or after the training. So the details about how to use this Q&A function will be put in the chat box by our Secretariat. So with this, now let me hand over the floor to start actual training by Aude and Hashmi, who will kick off this training with the first session, Graduation 101. So Aude and Hashmi, over to you.
Thank you so much, Yuki. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I'm talking from Paris, where it's still dark, a very early morning, and you might see the dawn break through as I speak. I'm really honored to be here and sharing the floor with Hashmi and Dristi. And I'm going to start on the next slide, talking about what do we mean when we say graduation. We heard from Karen just right now and in the video, but basically graduation is an imperfect shorthand to say graduating into sustainable livelihoods. It was an approach that was initially developed by BRAC in Bangladesh, and it was called Targeting the Ultra Poor program at the time. Basically, what we mean is a time-bound, sequenced, holistic, multidimensional approach that targets households, extreme poor households, with the idea that you can move them into sustainable livelihoods. The approach and the vision is really for this upward pathway to increased earnings and assets through viable livelihoods. Typically, graduation approaches include some of the components that you see on the left. For example, savings with the little piggy bank here, asset transfers or cash in the form of livestock or other types of goods, training, which is represented here by the whiteboard or the blackboard, and then coaching, which are the hands together on the little icons here at the bottom left. Basically, the idea is to combine interventions to provide something multidimensional, holistic, in order to tackle the multifaceted challenges of extreme poverty. It's really intended to be a big push with the idea that you can, if you invest in a meaningful way, you can really help people lift themselves out of extreme poverty. CGAP and the Ford Foundation piloted the BRAC graduation approach in 10 sites, and Innovations for Poverty Action and the JPAL, the Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab, conducted 7 randomized controlled impact assessments on the pilots, which documented increased household incomes and consumptions at practically all the sites. We'll hear more about this later, in particular from colleagues from ADB. We also, I just want to talk to the cost-effective point below. Basically, with the impact assessments at CGAP, we did a cost effectiveness comparison of different types of interventions. And we were able to show that among programs that target the poorest, graduation programs had the greatest impact per dollar spent, with a positive impact on economic indicators up to 7 years after the program's ends. So on to the next slide, please. So basically, some of you might already be familiar with this slide. It's very schematic, but the idea is really to show in one visual the different building blocks of the graduation approach. So as we heard from Karen and as we saw in the video, the graduation approach brings together several different interventions. At the bottom left, you'll see 2 green blocks, which represents what happens before the program starts. The first is very careful targeting. The program is expensive, as Karen said, and it's very intensive. It cannot be for everyone. So the idea is to really target carefully and make sure that only the people you want in the program are selected. Typically, these would be the extreme poor. And then we do a very careful market or value chain analysis. This program rests on the idea that you're going to help extreme poor households onto an upward trajectory out of poverty through entrepreneurship or access to employment. The idea is that you identify what are the livelihoods that have market potential and that people can engage in. It's no use to have everyone get goats or everyone get sewing machines if there's no market absorption capacity for those types of activities. So Hashmi will talk more about this later, but this intervention of doing careful market and value chain analysis is extremely important. Then on the right hand side, you see the 5 core building blocks. The first one is consumption assistance or consumption support. This is really the idea that before engaging in an intensive program, you need to make sure that people's everyday food needs are covered, that they have enough breathing space to engage in the program and don't need to think about their immediate next meal. Often, this consumption assistance is provided by an underlying social protection safety net program. The second building block here is the access to financial services. The idea is that soon after people start these programs, they are encouraged to start saving, if possible, formally. The idea is that people start to save formally, build the habit of savings, build themselves a cushion with some financial savings, and also the arrow continues, because the idea is that people continue saving after the program is over. The training here is a small box just to say that really, as Karen said, and as we saw in the video, the training is not very intense. The idea is to do some on-the-spot training. If you're going to transfer an asset, for example, a sewing machine, as we saw in the video, then you want people to know how it works, how to repair it, and the basics of how to run that livelihood. The next and biggest piece of this is the transfer of an asset, seed capital, or sometimes an employment opportunity. The idea here is you're going to transfer something that allows people to really move into a sustainable livelihood. The idea is that this package should be big enough to be meaningful. Initially at BRAC, there was a basket of assets, typically livestock, for example, 1 cow, 2 goats, 5 goats, 3 chicken, 10 chicken, 5 ducks. So something that helps really, that's big enough and really helps people start a small enterprise. As programs are scaling up, these assets are typically more likely to be in the form of cash, but the idea is always to really base this on the careful value chain analysis that you've done beforehand and see what is the right form and size of assets that can really help push people over a threshold and become successful in their enterprises. The last long bar at the top is what Karen said sets the approach apart, what Hashmi and I typically used to call the secret ingredient. Basically, it's the very careful mentoring of people as they enter into the program. It's the close accompaniment of each individual through regular coaching. In the pilots, typically program staff visited participants in their home each week to monitor their progress, check on the different assets, but also look around the house, see how everyone was doing, check on the children, and really help coach participants and aspire to something better in their lives. This mentoring approach, as we've heard, is very staff intensive and thus it's costly. And Karine alluded to the fact that increasingly we're testing approaches that do this coaching in forms of groups or through peer-to-peer coaching. Tomorrow we'll also hear about some efforts to do this coaching in part through digital means in order to reduce the costs. But really, this is a very important element of the program. So now I'll turn over to Hashmi for him to guide us through some of the more detailed aspects of the targeting, the coaching in particular. Thank you. Over to you, Hashmi.
Thank you. What could somebody change the slides? There, okay, yes, done. All right, extremely important for your programs, however way you design it, to determine who you're trying to reach or serve. And I've been working a lot in India very recently. So for example, India has a fantastic rural livelihoods mission, even at the state level, reaching out to many of very poor people. But in all the instances, they recognize they're missing out some. And that's what they want to reach. And that's why they're thinking of their graduation approach. So for them, it was many who were referred to as scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, who had specific minorities who weren't being reached. or in other cases, like in Bangladesh, it's just people in extreme poverty. So once you've defined and in many cases, it may not be the poorest. So you need to define very carefully who you're targeting and then determine how best to reach them, how best to identify them. Sometimes governments do have databases that you could use. Sometimes, so for example, in India, in the state of Jharkhand, there are specific areas where there's a lot of the indigenous, well, they refer to them as tribal people, tribal groups who live there. So even if it is just going to those specific districts and identifying who these tribal populations are may be good enough. Because targeting can become very expensive and we want to avoid that. In some cases where you really want to go deep, that's where you can do community wealth ranking and means test, which again becomes expensive. You may not have to do it, but if you're really eager and if you really think some are still getting left out, that might be a way to do it. And then, of course, it's always good to go in and do some on-site verification. So once again, for targeting, think of the costs, easy ways to do it.
Odd. I think Hashmi, his video is
Okay.
frozen right now.
Yeah, okay. I was wondering if it was just me. Okay, so Hashmi is in Bangladesh, and sometimes you probably know there's a load shedding and the video and the internet goes off. So let me just pick up from here. Hashmi was talking about the targeting and the importance of being very clear about who you want to target and to think carefully about the costs. The other thing that we wanted to go through with Hashmi was the coaching and the importance of behavior change. If you can, Jen, kindly move to the next slide, I'll talk to that. Sorry, so that was the additional slide from Hashmi, which is extremely important before we go to the coaching. This really, we wanted to really hone in onto the importance of integrating into local economies. I talked about the market assessment and the value chain analysis. What we want to highlight is that it is important that this approach is fully integrated into the local opportunity. So you really need to look for livelihoods where there is potential for people to engage in and expand. You can look in the publication that Hashmi provided in the link to read more about some of the value chain analysis and some of these exercises. Hashmi, you're back.
Sorry.
So let me just finish the sentence and say that, and pass it over to you, but say that there's a great importance of looking into the different value chains and different activities that people can engage in. Hashmi, can I turn it over back to you on the local, integrating into local economies?
Yes, thanks. It's very important to be able to figure out what alternative livelihoods you want to create for them. And here, in the past, for example, or if it's a small program, you can give them an asset, they enter into a livelihoods, and it's fine. But part of what you want to do also is not giving them a livelihood where they increase incomes to be able to be food secure. You also want to make sure that they're on a pathway, a ladder that ensures that slowly but surely they're becoming part of the emergent middle class. So that's why looking at livelihoods, not just to provide subsistence, but later on that can leads to higher productivity and larger gains. So that's why looking at the value chains. I'll give you an example. In some of the forest areas in India, I don't know if you're familiar with custard apple, but they harvest custard apple. It's just really delicious fruit. But it rots really fast. So while a lot of the tribal populations would collect them and sell them, they couldn't store them. And it was such a short duration that to sell them cheap. So now, in terms of the value chain, they brought in someone who developed this system of taking the inside of that, the pulp, and then freezing it and storing it and selling it to the cities to be made into ice cream. You know, right there you open up the real possibilities. Or if farmers producing soybean move up the chain, collectively community-owned soybean presses that can make oil. So you really have to look for opportunities, really have to ensure that you've identified meso-level interventions, linked up, so people are left with more and more opportunities. Go ahead, Ode.
So the next slide, please. It's on coaching. Hashmi, do you want to talk to this?
Sure. One of the things we've recognized, and everyone's been said that from Karen to Ode and others, it's the coaching. We've all realized that a big thing, and in your interactions with poor people or isolated communities or marginalized communities, you've realized the lack of basic confidence because they've been oppressed for so long, they've been marginalized for so long, and they've lost confidence in themselves, they've lost hope. So that part is very important. Periodic meeting with them, helping them identify their trajectory to economic livelihoods and welfare, making them recognize what's out there in public space, immunization for the kids, for themselves, healthcare, preschools, so that they can link up to that. And then usually it's weekly, but it can be done collectively, community groups and others, and even through technology. But you need this close monitoring to always make them understand that they can do it. If they fall off, go off track, go back to them. Then they can do it. And that takes time, usually a year, a couple of years, or even much longer. That part is important to do. We have to come up with cost-effective ways of doing it, but that's the most important element. Go ahead, Ode.
Thank you, Hashmi. And as you said, there are a lot of innovations happening in this space of finding cost-effective ways to coach and help keep households on track. And tomorrow we'll hear about Comcare in particular in one of the breakouts. So that's going to be exciting. Just if we go on the next slide, I want to talk about what is it when we say graduation. What is the end goal? When we say people graduate, typically some people ask, is this like high school graduation? No, the idea here is really to say graduation is the fact that people have moved into sustainable livelihoods and are out of extreme poverty. There's no overall definition for graduation because it's extremely context specific and it depends on the households you've targeted. So each of the criteria are context driven, but across the board, what we see is typically graduation indicators include something around food security, something around increased assets and income, something around income diversification so that households are more resilient, and something around social change, mental health change, something around behavior change, better health access, improved self-confidence. And even in the CGAP Ford Foundation pilots, we were monitoring for people's perceived happiness and well-being. On the next slide, we're going to see some examples of graduation criteria at the Padayan SPL project in the Philippines. Mr. Edmund Monteverde is online, and he's actually going to tell us more about this project later. So I'm not going to talk to it right now, but we will really turn to this later. But what I wanted to show here is just to say that there are some desired outcomes on all of the different buckets of graduation, and then each program sets its own criteria for what is the threshold that you want people to have met by the end of the program. So Hashmi, I'll turn it over to you to wrap up on some of the challenges to scaling. Thank you.
Yes. Am I not? Can't you see me? Let's see. How do you want to?
You need to put your video back on, but it's okay. We can hear you.
All right. So when you're scaling up, you know, when you start a pilot or with a few hundred or even a couple of thousand program participants, it's pretty easy to do. The real challenge is how do we get to the hundreds of thousands, or in the big countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, India, how do you even go up to the millions? And that's where it's vitally, and also as part of that, how do you ensure that people who've gone through this graduation pathway are able to sustain their economic benefits, their economic gains, and continue to move up? So here, just a few critical things I want to point to. To be successful, you have to be engaged in close monitoring. And that's either for a small project or a large project. So if you're going into the hundreds of thousands, the monitoring must be easy, simple, but extremely reliable and effective. And there are many models of how you do the monitoring. I don't want to go into that. But building the capacity of your staff to be able to do this in huge numbers, that's important. So staff training, staff hiring, what type of staff do you want to bring in? What do you want them to do? Break down the tasks so it's simplified, it's easy. So the capacity building is important. And then on top of that, vitally, vitally important, because for poor people or for any of us, it's not just the economic part that makes us lead a life of good, a good life. It's many other things. See, for the poor too, and for your participants, it's not enough that they're on a trajectory of economic benefits, but health. So how do there are, and it's not that you should be providing health services, but there are healthcare services. How do you link up with them? How do you link up with early childhood development, early childhood education? So there's human capital development for early on. How do you link up with so many government programs that are out there? I told you I was working in, I've been working in India. The government has many, many, many safety net programs. So being able to link up with that. The government has many training programs, being able to link up with those. Because for young people, you want to provide employment, not just a small business. And that's going to be the future, employment. So how do you link up with training programs to have them be ready, soft skills and hard skills training, to have them be ready, be employable? So the convergence with government programs or NGO programs is essential if you want to be able to build all-rounded resilience. Because just income increases, one catastrophe at a personal level or like the COVID, that's going to push them back. You need to build resilience around that, and you do it through convergence with other programs. Go ahead, Oak.
Thank you. And ADB has already shared with us some of the questions that are coming up on the Padlet, and we'll be very happy to address those in the Q&A session. I was just reading through them right now. I'm just going to quickly give you a few slides of overview from the State of Economic Inclusion report. This is a flagship, as they call it, a World Bank publication that I co-authored last year. Hashmi also is one of the co-authors. And it was published by the World Bank Social Protection and Jobs Group. The objective of the report is to provide a global assessment on the state of economic inclusion programs that reach the extreme poor and vulnerable across the world, including in particular looking at World Bank operations. We used artificial intelligence to scan the World Bank's portfolio and look for this type of program that is graduation without calling itself graduation. It was downloaded over 40,000 times to date, which really shows that there is a large interest in this kind of program. In the chat, Jen and Sheila are going to share with you both the actual report and places where you can read some shorter versions of the report, including blog posts and just the report overview, which is 10 pages long. The quick things I wanted to share about this is that graduation programs are broadly on the rise across the world. And this was done right before COVID. And what we know is that COVID has led to an explosion of these types of programs as governments were looking to increase the short and medium term livelihoods opportunity of people right after the COVID economic crisis. What I want to show here through this slide is that graduation programs are being implemented in 75 countries with over 200 programs. And this translates broadly into 90 million beneficiaries. And these are really lower bound estimates. What we can see, and this is the bottom part, is that there's broadly the same number of NGO programs and government programs, but what you see with the bottom is that government programs are serving a vast majority of the beneficiaries. So basically, NGO programs might be numerous, they're usually smaller and sometimes, serving very hard to reach or particular populations. Government programs are really bringing this approach to scale. The next slide, please, shows that program components, generally, these programs include an integrated package, which is the basis of graduation. And we've counted that a majority of programs include 5 or more components. And you can see the components on the side. The programs are typically time-bound and they are deliberately sequenced. We see that the top 3 things that programs bring together are typically the transfer of an asset, financial support, skills training, and careful coaching or mentoring. So very typical to a graduation, a typical NGO graduation programs. 2 things to note is that there are 2 interventions that we've seen are developing very broadly. The first is that 71% of programs actually assist participants with some form of market linkages or some form of integration of support to help people integrate into markets. So this really addresses the point Hashmi was talking about earlier with the example of the custard apples, but there's something that is being done to help very poor people link up and sell their produce into the markets. The second, and we'll talk about this more tomorrow, is that a large portion of these programs, over 57% of all programs, are actually doing something on natural resource management for greater resilience. So really the idea here is that most graduation economic inclusion programs are actually doing something to help mitigate or adapt to climate change. We'll talk about this tomorrow. We'll have a whole session on resilience, but just to note here that this is really a component that's on the rise within economic inclusion programs worldwide. The next slide shows that programs are typically, graduation programs are typically have very broad objectives. The idea is always to help increase people's assets and incomes and move into more sustainable livelihoods. But sometimes these programs are, have a special focus on food security, on resilience, on women's empowerment. And so these programs basically are quite diverse in their objectives. One of the objectives that I just want to briefly talk to, and I know Hashmi will want to come in and comment also, is women's economic empowerment. On the next slide, please. What we're seeing is that graduation programs, because they're so multidimensional and holistic, they provide a very good underlying basis to develop women's economic empowerment programs. The graduation programs that want to have strong impact on women's economic empowerment need to be really smart in the way they design their programming and in the way they deliver their programming. I'm not going to read this slide, but you can read it for yourself, and also we'll be sharing more materials on this later. But basically, one thing that I want to pull out is that we have not been very good at identifying the impact of graduation programs on women's economic empowerment so far, but we know that this is something we need to get smarter on. Going forward, we want to be much more deliberate in actually tracking and monitoring the effects of graduation programs on women's economic empowerment. Hashmi, over to you.
I just wanted to add a couple of things here. When we're looking at women's empowerment, and I know some of you must have background in, and actually maybe you're specifically working on gender issues, which I have for many years now. One of the things that within the graduation program we're able to do very easily, is to be able to provide economic resources to women. That's easy enough. We're targeting them, we're giving them some asset, or we're giving them a training and lining them up for jobs. That's easy enough. The second part of what we're doing within the graduation program is to make women feel confident, assertive, be able to have control over their money, be able to have control over their economic resources. That too, we're able to achieve without much difficulty. It's a long process, but we're able to achieve that. What we're not able to do is move beyond the household level. So at an individual household level, women do become more assertive. But the next stage, if we're trying to confront gender inequities, if we're looking at gender subordination, and I don't want to go into that too much now, but I'm free to talk to any of you offline about this, which is organizing women to look at societal gender injustices and confronting them. So for example, things like inheritance rules, or things like deep-seated biases against women. So for example, in many cultures, when women have babies, they are when they're pregnant and then they're delivering, they're set aside. Or deep-seated values on what women can do or cannot do, or deep-seated structural biases against women in terms of their access to justice. That takes collective action. We don't do it in terms of the graduation approach, but in India, I would love to say this, is that they're doing that with the self-help groups interlinked on top of gender. So we can talk about that later, but I just want to leave you with that. Some household level, individual level changes, women's empowerment we're able to achieve very easily, but we really have to think if we are challenging structural gender inequities. Thank you.
On the next, yeah, sorry. On the next slide, we've pulled out some of the future directions that we saw in the State of Economic Inclusion reports, with some newly targeted groups emerging. We heard in the video and in Karen's introduction that typically graduation programs target adult members of the household. Now, this is the majority of programs, but I also wanted to kind of pull out the fact that increasingly we're seeing programs target youth. BRAC has started with a adolescent girls livelihoods program, but there are other pilots which are really looking at graduation to help bring poor and isolated youth into broader economic opportunities. That's very specific to places where there's a youth demographic, a strong youth demographic and high levels of unemployment, for example, in MENA, where they're using graduation to try and move youth into self-entrepreneurship. Another thing that I wanted to highlight is that there are that the context is changing. Initially, these programs were very often in rural contexts, but increasingly we're seeing many more urban contexts, and I think several of the examples we'll have here will be in urban context from participants, and we're seeing an increased prevalence of these types of programs in fragile settings, including climate or conflict affected countries. And the last thing I wanted to highlight is just that we're seeing a lot of innovation, in particular the digitization of programs, with digital coming in at several places throughout the program delivery, in particular for the transfers of payments, but also in the coaching and the monitoring. And with this, I will like to really stop here. Over to you, Hashmi, in 1 second, and we'll open the Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, just want to say that what Yuki has been able to do by bringing you together is challenge us to look at future directions in graduation. You have a lot of specific problems, and you bring those to us, whether it's about resettlement, whether it's about climate refugees, whether it's about youth, or specific segments that are getting left out. This will challenge us to focus and come up with new ideas with you together to really go into future directions. And because of Karen and Yuki, and my respect for both of them, I will volunteer my time and Zoom calls even after this, because it's exciting for me. So go through Yuki, bring in your problems, and you'll get 30 minutes to an hour for me for free anytime you want to.
Odd and Hashmi, I'm just wondering, because this session is very important for everyone, and I guess we have a lot of questions that we want to ask, but some of them are already in the chat box. Perhaps it will be helpful if we proceed to the next one, because they will give a little bit more of a breakdown of what we really mean by what you had just explained during the graduation one-on-one session. So if you agree, would you like to go ahead ahead with the next session, and we can have a larger Q&A session after that. There are some questions about level of financial literacy, about mentoring, about the randomized control trial studies, which we'll listen to the next session, and targeting, and graduation criteria, and other services, including asset transfers. So those are some of the questions that are coming from the audience through the chat box. So Odd, would you agree with it? Or would you like to pause here and get the Q&A done? Okay.
No, I'm happy to continue if you think that makes sense. I'm also monitoring the questions and really great questions coming in. Please keep them coming, and we'll address them in the Q&A. So with that, then Jen and Sheila, if you can continue. Thank you to this overview of how graduation builds onto social protection systems or into social protection systems. If we go to the next slide, I'm just going to this is ADB's graduation framework, which a lot of you are familiar with and several of you authored. But basically, you'll see here what ADB considers the 4 pillars, foundational pillars of graduation: social protection, livelihood promotions, financial inclusion, and social empowerment. However you want to think of it, Hashmi and I showed 5 core building blocks here. We have 4 foundational graduation pillars. Basically, you can think of this conceptually however you want, but basically there are broad buckets of things that need to be done in order to help tackle the multidimensional aspects of extreme poverty. On the next slide, I just want to remind everyone that the idea for graduation programs to go to scale is really to build on underlying government interventions. This slide is from the State of Economic Inclusion reports, and you can see that the programs predominantly, the 250 programs that we surveyed predominantly build on government interventions, either in the sector of livelihoods and jobs or onto pre-existing safety nets. That means that graduation leverages the targeting, the delivery mechanisms, the social registries, etc., of an underlying government interventions in the area of livelihoods and jobs development or of a safety net. On the next slide. Hashmi, do you want to talk about the different pathways we see for graduation?
Sure, but I'm not seeing the slides. Are
You're
the slides
seeing
visible?
Yes, they are for us. So Hashmi, this is the slide where we have the buckets of full implementation, convergence, or layering.
Why don't you start with that, and I'll see if I can see the slides.
Okay,
Go ahead
perfect.
with that. I'll join in.
Perfect. So the idea, as I said, is really, if possible, to leverage an existing intervention. We've kind of conceptually broken this down into what we call full implementation. If there's nothing there, or if an NGO, for example, is designing this on its own, for example, BRAC, when it started in Bangladesh, basically the NGO is going to do the full delivery of the model. In other places, there are already bits and pieces of graduation, very important bits and pieces of graduation already being delivered by the government or maybe by NGOs locally. And it's really going to be about bringing together, and this model we call convergence. And a very good example is Padayan in the Philippines. The idea is really to bring together interventions that the government was already doing and really package them so that they are provided in a sequenced way and each intervention becomes more meaningful for the household. And then another model is the layering onto an existing social protection program. For example, in Sahel, there's a series of programs that are called the Sahel Adaptive Social Protection Programs in 6 countries. Basically, the government provides social safety nets, and onto this safety net are built graduation components for some subsegments of the recipients. So people will all get the underlying safety net interventions, and some will get additional components that are related to graduation. Another good example of this is Juntos in Peru with the Hakuwinai program, and both the Sahel and the Hakuwinai with Juntos in Peru are case studies at the end of the State of Economic Inclusion report, so you can read more if you're interested there.
And when you're looking at your own programs, think of these, and what other scaling pathways would you be able to develop? What we're showing you here is what we have been seeing so far. Maybe there are new ways of doing it, but this should help you to try to imagine how you want to see your program scaled up.
Thank you. And now we want to turn over to Mr. Edmond Monteverde from the Philippines and Mr. Ricardo Baba from India to really guide us through how these programs have been implemented in 2 different locations.
Iba yung ano?
Sir Edmund, over to you.
Yes, yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah. Good day to everyone. Next slide, please. Next slide. So the content of my presentations are Padayon SLP overview, just to give you a brief background on what Padayon SLP is all about. Then the illustrative graduation timeline, the graduation interventions to sustainable livelihood program, the monitoring results and ways forward. Next slide, please. My apology that I opt to off my camera due to stability of the signal. Okay. The Philippine government, through the Department of Social Welfare and Development, under its program Sustainable Livelihood, implemented the Padayon SLP Graduation Approach pilot project in partnership with ADB, DFAT, and BRAC Ultra Poor Graduation Initiative. This pilot project has started its implementation last CY 2021 in 3 provinces, Iloilo, Bukidnon, and Sultan Kudarat, in 5 municipalities, with 2,810 program participants who belong to 4-piece household, the Pantawid Pamilya household, under the level 3 of well-being, meaning in the self-sufficiency level. Okay, the project aims to improve a different aspect of well-being, such as discipline in income, increase in income, savings generation, financial management skills, food security, nutrition, health and hygiene, and access to local resources. This intervention also assists the participants in their economic recovery and the rehabilitation of the livelihood, especially on the effect of the COVID-19. Next slide, please. Okay. This is the illustrative graduation timeline. The Padayon SLP uses the 4 graduation pillars that have presented earlier that utilize a set of holistic time-bound, tailored intervention to address the multi-dimensional nature of poverty. 1 is the social protection, 2nd is the livelihood promotion, 3rd is the financial inclusion, and 4th is the social empowerment. The social protection support the basic income security and immediate needs such as consumption support and access to health and education. The livelihoods promotion consisting of a cash grant to start or grow existing livelihoods along with technical skills training to manage the livelihood. Then we have also the financial inclusion in ensuring safe, reliable, and direct access to formal financial services. And this is accompanied with the financial literacy training. Last is the social empowerment through regular check-in coaching and mentorship by frontline staff and life skills training that builds knowledge on social and health topics. Next slide, please. Yan. The project builds on two existing departments. This is fortunately, we have two flagship program in the Department of Social Welfare and Development, the Sustainable Livelihood Program that provides capacity building to capacitate the program participants to become an entrepreneur prior of them entering into a formal business setup. And the other program is the 4Ps, or the Pantawid Pamilya Filipino program, which is a conditional cash transfer program which graduation additions to provide participants' household with a comprehensive and sequenced sets of intervention and strengthen the impacts of the project. The illustration shows the components of SLP and 4Ps that are integrated. If you would notice in the slide, there is the 4Ps column wherein integrated into Padayon SLP project along with the SLP processes, existing SLP processes, and then the graduation additions. These are the value additions integrated in the process for us to be able to achieve eventually the graduation criteria of the Padayon project. I will not mention the details, but as you can see, these cover the 4 graduation pillar of the Padayon project. Next slide, please. So since the project is on its last implementation stage, a regular monthly monitoring through home visitation has been conducted by the field workers or field implementers, which reported that along its graduation intervention result on the increase of income. That's a proof of concept that we gathered during our field visit with the 3 pilot regions of the Philippines. The program participants demonstrated increase of income, positive behavior on the perspective in life, which they are more now productive compared before. Increase in savings, which inculcate discipline of savings, wherein they religiously generate savings every month based on the agreement within the Sustainable Livelihood Program associations. And a strong joint decision making, meaning it's more on a consensus building before they will decide specifically on the major decisions that they want to implement along with the operations of the project and even within among the association's operations. And lastly, the participation in the community activities has been manifested to our program participants. So they go they extend their services to the community, such as volunteerism for the clean and green, and helping our health workers during the supplementary feeding, etc., etc. However, it is also recognizable that these pilot projects encountered some challenges. One is the participants' attrition. From the 3,000s, we're down to 2,810 active participants. Along its implementation, participants have waived. Some have waived its participation for the reasons that they move out from their barangays due to employment opportunity. Definitely, we cannot hold them. It's their own more. It's their own decision. No? Also, one of the challenges that encountered by our program participants is the effect on the outbreak of the African swine fever. Since some of our program participants are engaging into hog raising. So livestock diseases encountered and the calamities that adversely affect majority of the livelihood, especially on those areas in Region 12 in Sultan Kudarat, where in Typhoon Paeng hit the area adversely. So currently, what they are doing right now is they are conducting an assessment by our field workers to address the concerns such as reveal their livelihood assistance through seeking support from the local government units. That's one, and other national government agencies. However, the good thing is that the SLP Association have an average, has an amount of savings generated that they can be start off to rebuild their proposed project, but still subject for the assessment if still be feasible at this moment, while waiting for the support coming from the national government agencies and the local government units. So that's the beauty of having them generated savings of an average of 9 months, starting first quarter of 2022. Next slide, please. So what are the ways forwards? Now, first, the continuous regular monitoring, coaching, and mentoring. Hand-holding activities with SLP team, meaning there is a transition plan that we issued to our regional offices to join for the regular SLP field worker to join the field workers hired by BRAC on the monitoring activity as part of the transition once the program about to end now by January 2023. This is for the smooth transition of the project to DSWD SLP. Also, a knowledge sharing next month. There is a plan for a knowledge sharing next month that will be conducted among concerned partners as a wrap-up and discussion of learning strategies and innovation of the pilot project. And lastly, on the part of the DSWD Sustainable Livelihood Program Office, we are currently assessing the project implementation for policy enhancement of its program, of the current program guidelines of the regular SLP to include the best practices and strategies that will prove based on the result of this Padayon pilot project towards the success of our 4-piece Pantawid Pamilya beneficiary under this Padayon pilot project approach. So that would be all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Should we move over to Ricardo?
Okay, I can proceed. Just let me know if I'm audible.
You are. Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you very much. I'm Ricky Barba. I'm going to show the, please, next slide, please. Right. I'm going to share experience from the Inclusive, Resilient, and Sustainable Housing for Urban Poor Sector project in Tamil Nadu in India. And this is an application of the graduation approach in resettlement implementation. So if I can relate it to the previous slides, this is a convergence between the graduation and actual resettlement implementation. Next slide, please. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Ricky Barba. I'm Principal Safeguard Specialist at the front office of the South Asia Regional Department. And if you could turn your camera, I'm joined by Saswati Bilyapa and our colleagues from the Tamil Nadu Urban Housing Development Board. So I am the person who processed the project as the mission leader, and I don't have you should not credit me for the safeguards work. That's Saswati, and the implementation of the graduation program is from the TNU HDB team. So if they've turned on their videos, please remember their faces. They will be the ones to answer the question. But the project is multidimensional, and also it has several outputs, but I'm going to focus on output number 1, which is affordable and improved housing for vulnerable communities constructed. Next slide, please. So I just want to spend a minute on context. We're working with vulnerable communities. You'll see in the slide that these are flood-prone communities living in the waterways. Next slide, please. We're looking at 9 areas, one of which is Red Yarpati, which is blown up on the right side of your screen. So the idea is to select communities that are affected by flooding. So the first map is with the blue dots is actually an actual flood map. So the communities proposed by government are the ones in the orange dots, and the map in the bottom is the modeled flood map. So we look at communities that are actually on the yellow and the blue map to ensure that they are prioritized. Now, any resettlement specialist who is here understands that the preferred way to minimize resettlement impacts is to either on-site development or moving them very close to the site. But in our case, you cannot do on-site development or in-situ development or move them very close to the site so that there will be less disruptions on livelihood as well as social networks, because it's a flood-prone area, right? And the idea is to remove that vulnerability. So the site has to be a sufficient physical distance, which will not have any risks anymore when they move from climate change. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to spend time on this slide, but I want to say that what we are trying to do is use the graduation approach as the framework for delivering resettlement implementation. Next slide, please. And so, just to refresh, and particularly those who are not from ADB, the resettlement objectives, aside from minimizing involuntary resettlement, and we've done that, that's why we're choosing only the vulnerable communities to actually move, is to enhance or at least restore livelihoods of all displaced persons to pre-project level and improve the standards of living of displaced, poor, and other vulnerable. And we are guided by policy, which is SPS, and the delivery is usually highlighted by the 3 bullets underneath, which is compensation for losses at replacement cost, assistance for relocation, productive opportunities, civic infrastructure, transition, development benefits, and compensation for income loss and livelihood sources. Let me put it against the project context again. We are moving people from vulnerable communities, and they are all poor. They're currently in slums. So the transition to a relocation site is very critical. Actually, the delivery of ensuring that their livelihoods are resumed, and also all the civic amenities that they used to enjoy, and possibly more, is the aim of using the graduation approach in this resettlement implementation. Next slide, please. So this is how it works. I don't see the whole slide. Let me just adjust a little bit. All right. So again, I think the idea is convergence. If you see the yellow boxes, those are what our resettlement framework provides as entitlements. But what we want to do is use the graduation approach to frame how it will be delivered. So for example, I'm not going to get into each of these boxes, but if you look at the rightmost side, we have in the compensation matrix, livelihood assistance, very typical of ADB resettlement planning. So there's 50,000 rupees for technical training and an asset package, right? But it's not sufficient to just provide the cash, right? And so using the graduation approach, already market and skills assessment has been undertaken, and household level livelihood matching to skills, resources, and interests has been undertaken. Let me explain that we're constructing affordable housing and construction is ongoing. So actually the graduation approach has not been fully implemented, but they also are designing tailored specialized trainings and professional vocational employment linkages for the youth. As Odd had explained earlier, there must be diversification. And so you target the ones who were earning at the sending site, and at the receiving site, you can diversify it also by working with the youth. So that is the idea. Second slide, please. So, I'm not going to go into this, but these are what has been undertaken because I think it's more important for us to discuss details in the Q&A. But in the next slide, I'm going to wrap up the presentation by explaining, next slide, please, that we're building affordable housing. Yes, that's the output, right? But we don't just want to build the structure. This building of the structures is informed by the graduation program. We've had the benefit of having assistance from people like Irina, who is also on the call to ensure that data is gathered prior to the move, to inform what livelihoods would be possible, what infrastructure would be created. So in the community that they will be moving in, we have designed livelihood training centers so that there could be continuous training on livelihoods. We've put open spaces so that there can be alternative livelihoods explored as well. So the idea is not just to construct the affordable housing, but to ensure that people that we move will thrive in the location so that they will not move back to their original location, but instead be able to continue their livelihood and be on an upward trajectory out of poverty. So let me wrap up there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think at least I've seen a lot of activity in the Padlet with the Q&A. I think, Yuki, if you agree, people should just raise their hand and speak up.
Yeah, hi. So perhaps the best way of doing it is there are several things in the chat box. So we can start picking on some of them. In general, as I said, they talk about the level of financial literacy, one of the 4 pillars, and also the mentoring. And based on the mentoring about the RCT studies, perhaps we can hold that for the next session. There are many questions about targeting and also targeting criteria and versus the graduation criteria. And there are also some aspect on the involuntary resettlement context, the asset transfer versus other services can be in lieu of the asset transfers. And also there are points made about the importance of coaching, hand-holding components, and integrating with other programs. That was a comment provided. And then also there are other questions about, again, the graduation criteria and the complementary programs. So those are kind of a broad strokes of questions that we received through the chat. But if any of you would also hold the questions because you wanted to say it on live, please raise your hand and we would be able to accommodate your questions as well. Or any of the comments or any broad comments about the graduation approach would also be good. So is there anyone who wants to, or should we just start proceeding with the ones in the chat box? So Odd, I guess while people are ready to speak up, maybe we can tackle some of the questions. Many of them are talking about targeting and also about targeting criteria and about the graduation criteria and how would the targeting criteria versus the graduation criteria would be kind of linked throughout the whole project duration. So perhaps maybe that component, maybe we can discuss first.
Perfect, thank you. And
Sure.
Hashmi, there are several questions on employment, on other than purely, and so just so for you to prepare on the employment and okay, thank you. So on targeting, I've actually provided some input already in the Padlet space where we can chat together, but there was a really interesting comment on the need to link the targeting, the graduation criteria to the targeting. I think what Hashmi said before is programs need to be very deliberate about who they want to target. Typically, programs look for the extreme poor with the ability to work, and we shouldn't be too narrow in what we mean by able to work. For example, a lot of the initial graduation pilots that we implemented did not focus on people with disabilities because we just thought we were going to look for people with the best capacities to work, but actually we realized that we were excluding people who maybe needed the program most, and that this program works well for people with disabilities who are able to work. And so just what we need to be conscious of is that this program cannot work for everyone. So you need to be very deliberate with your objective and your policy objective of who is it that you want this program for, and make sure that you specifically reach these populations and exclude the ones that you're not looking to target. Coherently, it's very important that your graduation indicators reflect, who you were looking for. For example, if you were looking to target, households with many children and children not going to school, which is one example of targeting criteria from Foncosé in Haiti, well, then it's very important that you measure and you use as a graduation indicator the fact that these households are now sending their children to school. Or for example, if you were looking for very poor people with high levels of food insecurity, then it is very important that your graduation indicators reflect that people have moved into greater food security. One thing that I want to highlight is you need to make sure that your targeting criteria reflect an actual program intervention. You cannot expect that people, for example, will have moved into way better housing if you haven't deliberately, as Ricardo pointed out in the presentation before, deliberately looked at these questions and provided interventions around housing. So just a rapid reply on that question of the targeting and the linking to the graduation criteria. And then I've already also provided in the chat a link to the graduation technical guide that we co-wrote, which goes extensively into this. Hashmi, over to you for the transfer of an asset versus other types of interventions.
Right. Okay. I'll say a couple of things on the graduation criteria also. Now, for me, it's very important that we're able to build a better future for the people we're targeting, very generally. So now, what does that entail? Some of it is about economic benefits. Some of it is about related things like, are children going to school? Children, do they have access to preschools? About access to immunizations, health, all that. So if your program is just delivering food security and small businesses, obviously your business or your program is not going to be directly linked to education. But the idea is this, that I am doing narrow graduation, providing food security, providing them with some assets to start a business, then directly that should lead to expanded economic opportunities, increased incomes, better food security. But then when you're designing the program, see if they're linking up with others or if they know of others. Because it's not enough to be increasing incomes. Chances are, if they're getting really ill, there's no place to go, or if they're not getting immunized, it's going to affect the economy, affect their income sources. So look at that. It's not a direct result of your program, but that should also be included in some of the tertiary things you're trying to do. Just wanted to get that out. Now, what we're focused on in graduation for the last 10, 15 years has been on transferring an asset, and this is what Brack has talked about in the past, transferring an asset, starting them on a livelihood. Now, for many people, micro business isn't the road they want to take, especially young people. Young people in a rural area don't want to stay there and then have a couple of cows and get milk and sell that. Of course, that too, remember we talked about value chains. But a lot of them would want to get jobs. A lot of them are going to be moving to peri-urban areas. Are we preparing them for that? That becomes important. So in terms of a livelihood strategy, we are doing, for example, resettlement. Some of them resettle because of because of railways or because of riverbank erosion or climate change. Then yes, some of them will be doing businesses, some of them will be doing employment. So you need to, and some of them would be doing maybe other things. In some areas, if it's smallholder farmers, that's the graduation trajectory for them. Not businesses, not employment, but how do they raise the productivity of their small farms? So that would involve insurance, weather insurance, involve providing better seeds and everything. So many different graduation pathways. Yes, what has been tested is the asset transfer one. And that was like stage one. But when you're imagining future pathways, look at the whole gamut. And employment is extremely vital. That I feel really is going to be the future of graduation. Oh, go ahead. Oh, one little thing that just popped up that I looked at, NGO-led implementation and government-led implementation. Now, yes, if NGOs are doing in the implementation, it's going to be far better done because there's more supervision, more monitoring. But how many can NGOs do? In the long run, I mean, Bangladesh is different. You've got BRAC, but other countries, it's going to be Philippines. It's going to be DSWD. So how do you work with governments? How do you link up with whatever exists? That's going to be where you achieve scale. So while NGOs may be good, you want them to be used for developing cutting-edge ideas, cutting-edge techniques, cutting-edge methodologies, but scaling up will involve government. And yes, some quality may suffer. I'm not going to say category that it will suffer. Some quality may suffer, but that's the choice. You do 500 or 1,000 households really well, or do you do 100,000 at scale and lose some of the quality? Those are the choices. For me, that's a no-brainer. You have NGOs develop new ideas, but you work with the government for scaling up. Go ahead, Ode.
No, this is great. Yuki, would you like us to continue the Q&A or move into the global evidence session?
Yeah, so why don't we first move into the global evidence section, because there is one question that specifically talks about RCT. So it's a good way and segue to go into that. And we still have at the end the Q&A session, and we hopefully would be able to end in time. So let's see how we go. We also have tomorrow. So let's go ahead.
Thank you very much, and always reminding everyone that you can post the questions in the chat, and you probably see that we're answering the questions as we go when we have a moment. So with that, just jumping into the awaited session on impact, Karen, when she started, said graduation is a very much proven approach, and some of you have referred to the randomized control trial, the impact assessment in the chat box. And so really what I want to do now is provide a very quick high-level overview of some of the impact findings so far, and then turn it over to Nasrina, who's really the specialist coming from Innovations for Poverty Action and being ADB's evaluation specialist herself. So with that, if we can move to the next slide. Thank you. So this slide, it's deliberate. It's the same slide. Well, it's a similar slide to the one you've seen just when I started, with the different icons of the increased income, savings, food security, better health, happiness. And this really represents the CGAP Ford Foundation pilots. We had 10 pilots in 8 countries. The countries in the different pilots in India are consolidated here. But basically, we had the chance through funding from the Ford Foundation to do a randomized controlled impact assessment. So gold standard evaluations to unpack the impact of the specific graduation of the graduation intervention versus a counterfactual of doing nothing or having just a cash transfer. What we were able to show is that graduation programs had statistically significant impact on consumption, on increased productive assets. Beneficiaries spent more time working, they spent fewer days going hungry, they experienced lower levels of stress, and overall we saw strong improvements in psychosocial well-being. Participants reported higher levels of happiness, lower levels of stress, and they also increased and had increased outcomes on some indicators of physical health and sometimes also of political engagement. As we said before, you know, we were very much hoping to prove women's empowerment results, but what our initial pilot showed was no strong outcome on women's empowerment. That said, we think that we didn't design well enough and that we didn't measure women's economic empowerment in a sufficiently structured way. In the scale up of these programs, for example, in a World Bank implemented scale up in Afghanistan, we're seeing very strong impact on women's empowerment. So we can talk to how to make these programs more gender transformative later. These studies were developed by some leading academics, Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, you probably know, got the Nobel Prize for Economics. And then there's Dean Carlin is the lead principal investigator on 5 of these randomized controlled trials, and he's recently been nominated USAID's chief economist. So these are really superstars of evaluation. The initial pilots were really positive, but when we did the State of Economic Inclusion report, next slide please, we also did a broader meta-analysis of impact findings so far. This can be found in the chapter 5 and chapter 6 of the State of Economic Inclusion report. We did an overview of 80 qualitative and quantitative impact evaluations in 37 countries. And what we found was that there was very promising evidence of short-term impact, but also evidence of some longer term impact. But 2 things we found. The first is that people who were participating in economic inclusion programs had higher levels of productive assets and were able to save more. The second is that they were able to consume more. They had higher level of consumption than those that didn't get the programs. What I want to say is that typically the consumption and income gains are very small in absolute terms, but because we're talking about the the poorest members of the population, in relative terms, these small improvements make a big difference in everyday lives. We do find in the longer term some evidence of impact on empowering women, but we were hoping also to see impact on child well-being, and those are more not so evident in the longer term. One thing to share is that 3 programs already have long-term evidence of 7 to 10 years, including one of the initial graduation pilots at Bandan, but also evidence from BRAC. And what we see is that the evidence of impact continues to grow over the long term. So it's very, very encouraging. With this, I'd like to turn over. I'd like to remind everyone that in the chat box you can find links to the State of Economic Inclusion report, which highlights chapter 5 and 6 highlights the overall impact review. And with this, I'd like to turn over to Nash to guide us through impact findings in details from the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you, Aud, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nash, and I'm here to present the evaluation results of the graduation of the ultra-poor pilot in the Philippines, looking at the 2-year impact of the pilot. So just to give you a very brief project overview, we've heard from Hashmi, Aud, and also from Karen about the elements and components of the graduation program, and we know that this is really designed to help poor households build sustainable livelihoods. This is a multifaceted program to support economic inclusion, and really this relates to the broader idea of social protection. However, this program has been evaluated in multiple settings and contexts, and we see very positive results. But we also see that in some instances it can be quite costly. And so the Philippine study was designed really to test the relative performance and cost effectiveness of 3 program variations of the graduation of the ultra-poor program, looking into those that were receiving consumption support via the CCT program or the 4Ps Pantawid program of the Philippine government. So we have 3 treatment groups that are included in the Philippine study, which was really looking at group livelihoods and group coaching, and comparing that to individual livelihoods and group coaching, as well as this more standard, more traditional version of the graduation program, which was individual livelihoods and individual coaching. And in general, we see that there is, in terms of results, the program beneficiaries of the graduation pilot fared better than those households that were in the control group across various key economic outcomes, whether this is consumption, food security, and accumulation of productive assets. Okay, next slide, please. And so this particular study was a partnership between the ADB, BRAC, and IPA, as well as the Department of Labor and Employment of the Philippine government. And so with support from the ADB, BRAC, and DOLE, or the Department of Labor and Employment, implemented a graduation pilot in Negros province, Negros Occidental specifically, working with newer recipients of the 4Ps program. So mainly those that received 4Ps from 2015 to 2017. IPA worked with partners with funding from ADB to evaluate the impacts of the program on various socio-economic and welfare outcomes. Baseline was conducted in 2018. A COVID survey was conducted in 2020, and in 2021, an endline study was implemented by IPA. And so this partnership is actually a successful example of a collaborative arrangement between the ADB, BRAC, IPA, and DOLE to really understand and generate knowledge of a particular program and see whether it's working and what are the components of the program that are actually working. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. In terms of research design, as you can see, all of the households that were in this program received consumption support by the 4 Ps, and that includes the control group, treatment group. Were receiving group livelihoods. This was about $1,500 per group of 5. And we see in this treatment 2 group that people were receiving individual livelihoods and group coaching, about $300 worth of individual livelihoods. And in the third treatment group, which was the more traditional graduation program, people were receiving $300 as well of individual livelihoods. And so it's very interesting to really compare group livelihoods to individual livelihoods, as well as group coaching to individual coaching, because we really want to see which ones are cost effective. At the same time, the researchers were really also interested whether there was something interesting that could come out of group livelihoods, right? Like, because some assets may only be bought probably with a larger amount of money compared to whether if you just receive $300, for example, where you could be choosing very specific livelihoods as well with that amount. Okay, next slide. So in terms of the summary of key outcomes, you can see here that graduation program beneficiaries relative to those households that were in the control group really fared better in terms of monthly household consumption, food security, productive asset values, as well as self-reported well-being, specifically for those who were in the individual livelihood group. And I'll talk about that in detail in the following slides. In terms of monthly household consumption, we can see that monthly consumption per capita was higher for the program beneficiaries relative to those in the control, as you can see in this graph. Those enrolled in the graduation program were able to purchase more non-food items as well. And there was about an 8 to 19% increase in monthly per capita consumption, or about 324 pesos to 728 pesos. Okay, next slide. In terms of food security, we see also an increase across treatment groups. All treatment groups reported significantly higher consumption scores. If you normalize all of these different indices and scores, there were 3 that were used to determine food security. There was a food consumption score, as well as a reverse HFIAS score and a rice and meat consumption index. And normalizing all of these, we see a standard deviation increase of 0.20 to 0.28 relative to the control group. Okay, next slide. As well as productive asset, we see significant findings for those that are in the treatment groups, specifically in the value of the assets. We see that there was an increase of about 1,954 pesos to 4,884 pesos in terms of asset value. If you can look at the graph on the left-hand side, those that were in the control group were receiving, had about 10,546 pesos in terms of assets. And comparing that to the other treatment groups, through T1, T2, and T3, we see an important increase as well. In terms of subjective well-being, graduation program beneficiaries showed lower levels of mental stress. If you can see on the graph on the left side, normalizing all of the scores that were collected during endline, we see that relative to the control group, there was an increase in terms of standard deviations from across the 3 treatment arms. But very specifically, we see an increase, a high increase of about 13.13 standard deviations for T2. Which is individual livelihood and group coaching. Okay, next slide. Right. In terms of household income, There was no significant difference between the control group and the treatment groups, but it could also be in part because income measures were quite noisy during the end-line data collection period. And so, yeah, this is something that, can also be, thought about more carefully because of that. Okay, next slide. Okay, I think there was a question earlier in the chat about, comparing, looking at coaching as well. And I think that's a very interesting question because, this program was really specifically tested to understand whether group variations of coaching as well as group livelihood would be more cost effective, given that, in terms of implementing at scale, we want to really be able to address that the cost issue of the program. And we can see that there's relatively similar impacts, specifically in terms of individual livelihoods, but generally individual livelihoods outperform group arms, and on a per dollar basis, individual livelihood arguably does better, but that can also be because of the choice of the livelihood, and at the same time, it could also be because of the some of the delays that were encountered in terms of implementation for group livelihoods as well. Overall, group coaching does perform better, specifically in terms of consumption, and it's actually much cheaper as well. And so that's actually something that we should be considering as well in terms of future implementation of the graduation approach. Okay, next slide. Overall, the graduation approach has worked in the Philippines, and the results are quite similar to the previous evaluations of the program. I can share with you the science paper that was conducted, and I think Odd did a very good job of presenting these results in a short amount of time. But if you want to go and read that as well, that's available online. And despite the challenges that were faced, as you know, this program was piloted during the time as well of the COVID-19 pandemic. It happened, the baseline. And so, that was also one of the considerations in the program. But because this was a randomized study, we know that the effects of COVID was felt across all of the treatment groups as well as the control group. So that did not really affect the integrity of the study. But generally, we see that we really increased household well-being on all of these multiple dimensions. However, there is room to refine the program design, and that can be something that future implementations and iterations of the program can look into. The study was also able to test whether providing business coaching and livelihood assets to groups could be delivered similarly at lower cost. And we see that coaching arms were equally effective, but group coaching may be more cost effective to implement at scale. Okay, next slide. And then this last slide just really talks about, opportunities for learning, future learning on the program. And I think there was a question on how we can really, differentiate some of the impacts of the program. I think it's important to note that the study, as well as the previous studies on graduation, were really a study of a package of interventions, and tweaking these interventions a bit, and succeeding studies does help us understand the impacts of the different components of the studies. But of course, there are also some constraints in terms of really comparing, and separating all of these different components as well, because that can be also costly in terms of evaluations. At the same time, looking at long-term impacts, I think there was also a question of whether this program can be monitored in the longer term, and that's also a very interesting thing. Some of the other graduation studies have been ongoing for a while, and so they were trying to really look at long-term program impacts as well. And in the Philippines, I think it would also be interesting to look at longer-term program impacts of the program. All right, I think that ends my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yuki, turning to you to see how you want to proceed on the Q&As. I've been actively trying to answer some of the questions while I'm listening to Nash. I'm happy to chime in also on select questions.
Yeah, so there are several questions in the chat box. Perhaps for this one, there's a question that there are two questions that perhaps we can use this to answer. One is about comparison of performance of NGO-led smaller and government-led larger programs. If there are any specific, specifically with reference to the key ingredients of graduation making an impact. So that was the first question. And the second question was about scaling. When we were talking about the scaling pathway, are there some major differences in terms of extending support between the full implementation? That's the 3 columns that you showed us, right? About the full implementation and convergence model. If you could throw some light on the convergence scaling pathway, that would be appreciated. So perhaps 2 questions. If any other people would want to raise their hands, we'll just wait for your readiness to raise your hand. So go ahead, Odd, with these 2 questions.
Thank you. I'd like to take the first and maybe invite Hashmi for the second on throwing some light on the convergence model. And then Nash, obviously, you're the specialist here. And so we'll all benefit from your more kind of technical researchers' input on this. Just on the first question of comparing the effectiveness of the graduation model implemented by NGOs versus governments, I've started to respond in the chat, but what I wanted to say is we don't have randomized controlled evaluations that compare an NGO implementation to a government implementation. That we don't have, and it might be part of a second generation research agenda. But in a way, it, you know, what is there to say? Like smaller pilot programs, obviously with super dedicated staff, they might be expected to have very strong results. What's really important to us, and we do have evidence about, and really the evidence is trickling in as we speak, is that we're already seeing government implemented graduation programs have very strong results. One example I put in the chat is the Sahel Adaptive Safety Net Program, which is being implemented in 6 countries in West Africa in very difficult climate affected context. And what we're seeing there are very strong impact results for a graduation approach that builds on a very small government cash transfer. And I shared in the chat a paper by Marcus Goldstein, Dean Carlin, Kelsey Wright, and others that shows that the graduation package for the ultra poor is really working. And what's particularly working well are some of the more psychosocial elements that were built onto the graduation interventions. For example, they did aspirational coaching, they showed videos to people, and that proved to really help the poorest engage onto a transformation trajectory. So again, some early insights. There's a meta-analysis that we did for the State of Economic Inclusion report with 80 programs, very largely government programs, and then some select research trickling in from places like Sahel, and I've provided some examples there, but very interesting question. Hashmi, that question of shedding light on the convergence model, I think is a very important one, and I'd like to turn to you. And Nash, I see your videos on.
Yeah,
so please,
no, I just wanted to add to what you said, Odd, earlier. I think that was a very good point that you made about, you know, looking at NGO-led and versus government-led programs. Definitely, I don't think there is one evaluation where we're comparing NGOs and a government program. Usually, I think in the science paper that was published on the graduation approach, some countries had had partnerships between the government and an evaluation group, and then there were some countries where NGOs were leading the implementation. For example, in Bangladesh, of course, you have BRAC, which is a very large NGO. And so across all of these different partners in that science paper, we see that, there were, great results, whether it was implemented by the NGO or the government. But as Odd mentioned, looking into scaling up, of course, there could be some advantage, if you look at it from the government side because of that ability to scale up. And I think what Hashmi mentioned earlier as well was, worth noting when he mentioned that this could also be an opportunity when you're thinking about innovations as well. You can work with an NGO who might be a little bit more flexible in terms of implementing innovative ideas and then working with government to scale these up.
Okay, on convergence.
Yeah.
Actually, the first time I heard the term convergence being used, and it immediately clicks and makes sense to me, was in a workshop that Karen and Yuki had organized, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago or something, or even later maybe. But it had to do with DSWD and the different programs they had, and some DSW personnel and some practitioners talking about interlinking some of those programs. So for example, if you have a safety net program, a cash transfer program, or even a conditional cash transfer program that are focused on poor people, that forms the basic consumption needs. It functions to meet that basic consumption need. And we know in a graduation programming that's important. Now, if you also have, along with that, some program, part of a government program, that either provides training or provides seed capital for livelihoods, that immediately forms another block. If you have that, linking up with that, that fulfills one of the pillars of graduation in being able to enable the livelihoods to happen. If you've got community level programs, it's like social programs or community asset building programs, and the World Bank has many of those. If you have that, that can be used, or even public works programs that build community assets. You use that also for the graduation linking up with that. So for example, I remember seeing in Kenya, how they were using, and in Malawi, how we're using those community resources to build community assets that could tie in with the livelihood. So remember I mentioned to you about the soybean example. So farmers producing soybeans, wanting to graduate, getting cash transfers for a limited amount of time to meet their food security, getting some more assets or some resources to plant more or better soybeans, but that the community asset is used to build a plant for soybean pressing, to make soybean oil. So that also connects with that. So it's important to see what you have. Some countries, like Haiti, for example, has no government programs. So then maybe it's something else. But especially in many of the Asian countries, the large countries, Philippines, Indonesia, India, even Pakistan and Bangladesh, there are lots of government programs. So how do you link up with them to provide you with a leverage to get your vision, your objectives met at a lower cost, so you don't have to do everything? That's the whole idea of convergence, or you can use linkages, whatever you may use. But I learned this from the Philippines. The word convergence immediately made sense to me. And I think we should first, instead of trying to do everything, which isn't going to be possible in the long run, either for the government or even NGOs, it would be just too much investment. We need to look at what's available, how we use all that. And each country will have their specific solutions, their specific resources. But convergence is going to be vitally important.
Thank you. Yuki.
Oh, so I think the time has come and maybe people might need to start leaving the meeting because of that. And I know there are more questions that we need to answer. We'll make sure that we will respond to them. And if not, maybe not by tomorrow, but definitely we will respond to them. So with this, is it okay that we will close the day 1 and we resume tomorrow at the same time for the day 2 session? Odd, would that be okay with you?
This is perfect. And I just wanted to say that I've been actively typing in the chat bot, and there's a lot of questions and links to further studies, answers. And, you know, please come back with some of these questions if they're not addressed. You know, we still have tomorrow. Thank you so much, Yuki, for the opportunity for us to share today, and looking forward to tomorrow.
Thank you. And once again, Timmy has already put in the question board. So even after this meeting, please click on and start typing your questions if the questions are not asked. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining today. And we'll see you back tomorrow. So nice to see you all. Thank you so much. Have a nice evening or afternoon.
Thank you.